صح؟ أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على رسوله الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. اللهم أخرجنا من ظلمات الوهم وأكرمنا بنور الفهم، وافتح علينا بمعرفة العلم، وسهل أخلاقنا بالحلم، وجعلنا ممن يستمعون القول فيتبعون أحسنه. اللهم اجعل أعمالنا خالصة لوجهك ولا تجعل فيها حظا لغيرك. وصل اللهم على سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين، والحمد لله رب العالمين. أما بعد، فالسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. كيف حالكم? How's everyone today? Good? Alhamdulillah. So yesterday we were busy with Hikmah number 15, right? مما يدلك على وجود قهره سبحانه أن حجبك عنه بما ليس بموجود معه, right? After the class, when Tawfiq was talking to me, I thought to myself that maybe I didn't clarify the meaning of it enough from the text itself. So I thought I'll just start off with indicating to that. So what he says is, from those things that indicate to you the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's quality of being compelling, or Allah's compelling nature, is that He veiled you from Him, that He, Allah, causes you to be veiled from Him, Himself, بما ليس بموجود معه, with what does not have existence with Him. Right? And I explain this idea of existence with Him, that being essential existence, right? Tied into one's essence. That means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot not exist. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has existence, and His existence does not come from other than Him. Whereas the existence of everything other than Him is mustamiddun minhu. It flows forth from Him. It is wujud dhilli. It is a shadow of the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So He's telling you that Allah causes people at times to be veiled from Him, right? With something that doesn't have within itself the capacity to veil. Just like the shadow of a thing cannot veil the thing that it is a shadow of. Right? You have the real and the shadow. The shadow doesn't have the capacity to veil the real. Right? The shadow doesn't have the capacity to veil the real. A shadow of one thing might veil something else. Right? But the shadow of a thing cannot veil that thing. So He's telling you, something that doesn't have the capacity to veil, it veils you. Or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses that thing to veil you. That is a sign of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being in control of everything. Because were it not Allah that's causing you to be veiled by this thing that doesn't have the capacity in and of itself to veil you from Allah, then you would not be veiled at all. So He's telling you that when you see this thing that doesn't have in its ability the capacity to veiling you, then you must know that there's some other being at play causing you to be veiled. So He's essentially telling you, when you find yourself veiled from Allah, the fact that you are veiled from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you that Allah is. So He's telling you, after you realize that what is veiling you from Allah doesn't have the capacity to veil you from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then the value of that veil falls away. I don't know if the more I'm explaining it, the more complicated it's sounding. Let me say it again simply. Here's the thing. It could be anything. This thing doesn't have the capacity to do something, but it seems to me like it's doing that thing. But I know it doesn't have the capacity to do that thing. Rationally, I will conclude that there must be something else that is bringing about the effect that I'm perceiving. That's simple enough. Right? So He's telling you, that thing that's veiling you itself, the very veil, is indicating to you that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in control of everything. So how can you still be veiled after that? He's telling you, if you look at anything in the world that's going to indicate you to Allah, the very thing that veils you from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is also telling you that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in control. So after that, how can you still be veiled? That's essentially what he's getting at. Right? How can you still be veiled? The next hikmah is like a supportive hikmah. It supports this one. It emphasizes its meaning, but he just unpacks it more. Right? So he says, is that one, is 15 clear now? Right, okay. Number 16. كيف يتصور أن يحجبه شيء وهو الذي أظهر كل شيء. How can it be conceived of that something veils him? How can you imagine that something will veil him? وهو الذي أظهر كل شيء. When he is the one that gave everything ظهور, that he made everything apparent. Right? So, or he made it manifest. Manifest, it means something you can witness it, right? You can see it. So how can this thing that Allah made visible, Allah made it visible, Allah made it apparent, how can that thing now veil the one who made it apparent? Right? That's what he's saying. كيف يتصور أن يحجبه شيء وهو الذي أظهر كل شيء. The meaning of أظهر كل شيء means أي هو الذي أوجد كل شيء. هو الذي خلق كل شيء. He's the one who created everything. He made it apparent from the planes of non-existence, if you want, and made it apparent into existence. So he created it. He brought it about. Now, when you know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought this thing about, how can you see that thing which is its effect without thinking of the one who gave it effect, its cause? How can you see the effects and then be veiled from the cause? Right? Just like any human being would naturally, when he sees a building, let's say he sees, what's a nice building? I don't know, Taj Mahal is coming to my mind now. Right? Let's say he sees a Taj Mahal. And then he looks at the Taj Mahal and he says, wow, he sees this whole thing. But he never for a moment thinks about the person who actually made that Taj Mahal. And he in his mind, he actually rejects that there's somebody that made the Taj Mahal. He sees, no, the be-all and the end-all is this Taj Mahal. Right? Or whatever. There's a beautiful masjid that we're in. Right? He thinks to himself that this masjid is all the be-all and the end-all. There was nothing that brought this Taj Mahal about. Wouldn't you consider that person to be a fool? When the building is only an effect of its creator. And so the angle of proof in this is that every single thing that we see around us, every single thing that we witness of physical, of material things, it was preceded by non-existence. Right? And a non-existent thing cannot bring itself about. Therefore, some other being must have brought it about. And if that same reasoning applies to the entire universe, right? And there's different ways of proving that the universe at one point did not exist. The most common one nowadays is the fact that the universe is expanding. And so if we go back in time, it must have been. If we go in reverse, it would be contracting. Science might tell you to a singularity, right? Until the entire universe was one thing. And then from that being that one thing, it came about. We will say, no, firstly, where did that one thing come about from? Right? What was the point before that there was a singularity? Or we might ask the question, well, why did it not remain as it was for eternity before that? Who made the Big Bang? Bang. Right? But there's other philosophical arguments that will prove to you that whatever we see around us at one point didn't exist. So the question then is, if we consider the whole, how did that whole, everything witnessable physically, come into existence from non-existence? It could not have brought itself into existence. Therefore, another being must have brought it into existence. If the being that brought it into existence also began to exist, right, then either you're going to end up in a never-ending chain, an infinite regress argument, which is logically fallacious. It's impossible. Right? Because you're saying things are all dependent on things that are dependent on other things. But really, there's no basis to their dependence. That's impossible. Or you're going to say it brought itself into existence. But the meaning then would be that it didn't exist. And this thing that didn't exist did something, which was bring itself into existence. And that's even more fallacious. Right? So the only option that you're left with is that it was brought into existence by something that did not begin to exist. And that is Allah. Right? So, what indicates that to you? Every single thing in existence, by its mere existence, right, and its nature as changing, indicates to you that it is basically shouting out to you that Allah is. By the mere fact that it exists, and the nature of its existence is such that it didn't always exist, it is shouting out to you that Allah is. So He's telling you, when the very things that you are looking at are shouting out to you that Allah is, how can you imagine that this thing will fail you when it's indicating to you that Allah is? How can the very proof that Allah is fail you from what it's trying to prove to you? Telling you, how can you conceive of this? It doesn't make sense. Then he says, كيف يتصور أن يحجبه شيء وهو الذي ظهر بكل شيء. How can it be perceived that a thing would veil Him, that a thing would veil Allah, basically render you unable to witness Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And here we don't mean physically with the eyes, we mean with your basira, with your heart. Right? وَهُوَ الَّذِي ظَهَرَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ. When He is the one who is manifest with everything. Not He manifested everything, that's the previous one. Here He is manifest with everything. So, what does this indicate? What's the difference in this? Because you might say, well, because Allah created that thing, Allah is manifest with that thing. When I see that thing, it indicates to me that Allah is. But here, Shaykh al-Buti rahimahullah ta'ala explains the meaning of this one is that when you look at everything around you, all of the things, they all have purposes. They all have purposes. And generally the purposes of things, especially in nature, is that they come together to make life livable. Right? Like you might see one day a puddle of water on the ground. And then you see the sun come out and that water evaporates. That's a phenomenon in creation. Right? And you might just look at that one thing and think, okay, there's a phenomenon, evaporation. But if you look beyond that, you'll see that, you know what, there's evaporation. Then there's condensation. Then there's all the other processes involved in whatever causes rain. What happens after condensation? What's it called? Precipitation. No? Yeah. And then eventually the clouds burst, there's friction and the clouds burst and then the rain falls. Right? And the fact that rainfall and they cause things to grow and they give us water to drink and all of those things. So that entire process, or every single phenomena in that process, they're contributing to something that has a purpose. If I look at my eye, it has some kind of flesh, it has rods, receptors, cone receptors, it has all of those things. There's light that shines, there's refraction that take place in my eye, and all of these things come together that enable me to see. right? And in my ear, there's like tiny bones, and then there's sound waves, and these waves cause the bones to vibrate, and that results in me hearing. Right? So then you have plants in existence, and the plants are, absorbing carbon dioxide, and then they're producing oxygen, and that allows us to breathe. And you see all of these systems and everything that we can we can see in creation. They seem to be complex things, right? That are coming together, or that are simple things coming together to fulfill purposes. And eventually they all filter into the purpose of making life livable and comfortable for us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that khalaqa lakum, that he Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created for us everything. وَخَلَقَ لَكُم مَّا فِي الْأَرْضِ جَمِيعًا. He created for you, meaning for your benefit, everything that is in existence, whatever is in the earth. So when we ponder about things, then we see that they fulfill purposes. But the purpose, the objective, must exist with someone, with some being. Right? The one who intended that purpose. And so, not by their very existence, but by their purpose and their function, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is manifest with him. Right? When I see something in creation fulfilling a purpose, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes manifest with that thing, because the mere fact that it has a purpose shows you that it must have there must be a being who had that purpose in bringing them about. Now you may think, okay, that applies to natural things. What about manufactured things, man-made things? Well, generally, when human beings make things, they make those things for a purpose as well. They have a final cause to what they do. What's called in philosophy as a final cause. There's a reason. There's something that they have in their mind that causes them to undertake an action to bring that purpose that they had in their mind into existence. Like if you take the handle of a window, you can see it's made up of small parts. Those parts come together to fulfill a purpose of keeping the window closed. Right? So it tells you that behind that there must have been an intelligent mind. The intelligent mind there is the human being's mind. But the human being also had a purpose. And he's a natural thing. And so it takes you back to Allah. Right? Or you may say, well, then what about art? What about art? Sometimes those things seem like they serve no purpose. Right? But generally, in the mind of the artist, he had something that he wanted to make manifest and express so that people could look at it and marvel at it, or he could look at it and marvel at it. And that too is a purpose that existed in the mind, who also has a purpose that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala becomes manifest with. And so, in the fact that things exist, you see the expressions of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's qualities in them, right? Of beauty and of jalal, of majesty, and all of those things. You see it in those creations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he says, كيف يتصور أن يحجبه شيء وهو الذي ظهر في كل شيء. How is it possible? How is it possible that a thing veils him when he is the one who is manifest in everything? He is the one who is manifest in everything. Actually, I think the explanation that I gave for the previous one is the one that applies to this one. Right? His qualities are manifest in everything. The one that we had here. So some of these things were a bit confusing for me also. Right? No. Yeah, I just mixed it up at the end. from the explanation of Shaykh Buti. Shaykh Buti's explanation is that ظهر بكل شيء is that in the fact that the thing has a purpose, in the fact that the thing has a purpose, that indicates to the tadbir and the order that stems from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As for this one, هو الذي ظهر في كل شيء, is that in everything that exists, you see the qualities of Allah. Right? Like Jamal, etc. You look at the flower, you see beauty in the flower. You look at the mountains, you see majesty in the mountains. All of those things. In Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being manifest in the thing is that you see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's qualities manifest in those things. Then he says, كيف يتصور أن يحجبه شيء وهو الذي ظهر لكل شيء. How is it possible to conceive that a thing will veil him when he is the one that is manifest to everything? Right? So you might think, well, how is Allah manifest to everything? What he means hereby is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is manifest to everything, or rather everything has the capacity to see the manifestation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Human beings, by the nur of their aql, of their minds, they are able to do this inference like I explained before. But then you may think to yourself, well, how is Allah manifest to the wall? How is Allah manifest to the trees? Right? So there, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is manifest to them. We don't have a rational proof for that. But we know that on account of the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informed us of that. Right? And also, you can also see that in the fact that they fulfill their natural orders. Right? So, one ayah that might indicate to that is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِن مِّن شَيْءٍ إِلَّا يُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِهِ. There isn't anything except that it makes tasbih of Him. Right? What does tasbih mean? I heard Maulana Khalil unpacking it for you last night. Right? وَإِن مِّن شَيْءٍ إِلَّا يُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِهِ وَلَكِنْ لَا تَفْقَهُونَ تَسْبِيحَهُم. But you don't perceive, you don't understand their tasbih. So the stones are making tasbih, the plants are making tasbih, everything around us all making tasbih. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is manifest to everything. To the human being through the nur of his aql. Right? And to everything else through a special nurun rabbani, a special illumination that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives to it, and we don't understand the nature of that. That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran about it. لَكِنْ لَا تَفْقَهُونَ تَسْبِيحَهُم. Can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala open it up to some people that they experience that? Yes, of course. Inanimate things would greet Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. The tree would cry for him sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and not only did he sallallahu alayhi wasallam hear it, but even the companions in the masjid would hear it. Right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can unveil people from those expressions of what we normally think to be inanimate, but that's not the norm. The norm is that we're going to see that pillar standing there and it's going to be standing there just like that all the time. We're not going to see it doing anything. Or yeah, it's tasbih. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can cause karamat and mu'jizat to happen. Right. Next one. كيف يتصور أن يحجبه شيء وهو الظاهر قبل وجود كل شيء. How is it possible that a thing veils him when he was the one who was manifest before the existence of everything? Right? So what's the proof in here? The proof in here is very similar to the proof in the very first part. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is al-qadim. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one without beginning. And everything other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a beginning. So before the beginning of the first thing, what was there? There was Allah and there was nothing with Him. كان الله وَلَمْ يَكُنْ شَيْءٌ مَعَهُ, as Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was and there was nothing with Him. And هُوَ الْأَوَّلُ وَالْآخِرُ وَالظَّاهِرُ وَالْبَاطِنُ. So He is the first. How can something veil Him when He is the one He was manifest before anything? So you might think, to what was He manifest? He was manifest to Himself. Right? But He was manifest. Is it now when something exists that is simply an existence that stems from Him, that thing can veil Him? It's mustamiddun minhu. It flows, it pours forth from Him. How can that thing now veil him? All that he's doing is posing a rhetorical question every time. Like, how do you, like, he basically wants to leave at the end of the day. How are you veiled? It's not possible to be veiled. Right? So then how are we veiled? Because we know ourselves. We read this stuff and it makes sense. But then how are we veiled? You see, that is where ghafla comes in. That is where ghafla comes in. When we're not functioning correctly, that's when we become veiled. When we become unmindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's when the very thing that stems from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala now veils us from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So if you read all the stuff, you might think at the end of it, okay, yeah, how is it possible that people are veiled? People are veiled on account of a sickness that is with him, and that is ghafla. Right? They must return to the absence of ghafla or the state of dhikrullah, the state of dhikr. Right? So, كيف يتصور أن يحجبه شيء وهو أظهر من كل شيء? How is it possible that a thing can veil him when he is more manifest than everything? Right? How is it possible that something can veil him when he is more manifest than the thing that's veiling him? That he is more apparent than the thing that's veiling him. How can it veil him? So, again, that ghafla, some of the ulama say, that a thing can become veiled on account of the intensity of its apparentness. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ وَنَعْلَمُ مَا تُوَسْوِسُ بِهِ نَفْسُهُ. We created mankind and we know what his own nafs whispers to him. وَنَحْنُ أَقْرَبُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ حَبْلِ الْوَرِيدِ. Right? And we are closer to him than his jugular vein. We are closer to him than his jugular vein. And there's other similar ayat that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about his closeness to us. And here we're not speaking about the closeness of distance, right? Or proximity of physical proximity. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not encompassed by time. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not dependent on time and space, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not كَأَنَ اللَّهُ وَلَمْ يَكُنْ شَيْءٌ مَعَهُ وَكَانَ اللَّهُ وَلَا مَكَانَ وَهُوَ الْآنَ عَلَى مَا عَلَيْهِ كَانَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala existed when there wasn't time or when there wasn't space. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is as He was. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not encompassed by space. So, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not being encompassed by space, and He never was and He never will be. Where did I start with this point? See, my mind wandered and I got lost. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's not encompassed by space. What is the point I was making before this? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is more manifest in, how can something veil us from Him when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is more manifest than the thing that is veiling? Or then Allah is more manifest in everything? I can't remember. That point will end there. But yes, وَنَحْنُ أَقْرَبُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ حَبْلِ الْوَرِيدِ. We're not talking about, that's what I was talking about. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He tells us in the Quran that He's closer to you than your jugular vein. And that is simply an expression, as other ayat of the Quran, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is closer to us than anything. But that proximity is not a physical proximity. That's what I was getting at, right? That proximity is not a physical proximity. It's a proximity of knowledge, a proximity of encompassing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is closest to us. But the ulama say sometimes when something is so close to you, you can't perceive it. Like if I take my finger and I put it right to my eye, the part of my finger that's closest to me, I can't see it. Right? Or sometimes, something, they say something is like it's in your face, but you don't see it. Right? Something is like it's staring in the face, but you can't see it. So that's how we are sometimes veiled from Allah. But He's telling you that the reality is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is still more manifest in everything. Why would Allah be more manifest in everything? What we spoke about before. Every single thing in existence is shouting out to me that Allah is. Every single thing in existence is a product of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation. Everything in the existence and its design is telling me that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in control. Even when I'm veiled from things, that veil is telling me that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. What else is there in existence that, that is testifying to something as much as everything is testifying to Allah? Right? There's nothing like that. There is nothing with as much adillah, with as much proofs, with as much indicators to their existence than there is to the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Because literally everything, even what is a proof for something else is also a proof for the existence of Allah. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is more manifest than everything. Then he says, كيف يتصور أن يحجبه شيء وهو الواحد الذي ليس معه شيء. How can something veil him when he is Al-Wahid? What does he mean by Al-Wahid? Al-Wahid, we might know the meaning of that from قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. He is the unique and indivisible. He is the one whose qualities, whose essence, whose actions are unparalleled or unlike the actions, qualities, and essence of anything else. Right? And therefore, if you know that everything goes back to him, you know that everything stems from him. He is Al-Wahid. He is the only being that has independent existence. And there is nothing that can have independent existence with him. I can go into a proof for that. The proof for that is that if there were another ilah with him, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, لَوْ كَانَ فِيهِمَا آلِهَةٌ إِلَّا اللَّهُ لَفَسَدَتَا. Right? If there were an ilah other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if they were in the heavens and the earth, an ilah other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, لَفَسَدَتَا, then they would not exist. Some ulama, they differ. They say that is a fasad of order, that there would be corruption in the land, there would be disharmony. Others say, no, what it means is that if it were rationally possible that there be another ilah, another being with the qualities of Allah, then the heavens and the earth would not exist at all. But the fact that something exists, it tells you that Allah is one. So how is that? How is that? So I'm going to explain to you that proof. Right? The proof for that is that something coming into existence is dependent on a power that brings it into existence and a will for it to exist. Right? And the will to bring it into existence. So he says, if you consider that there's two ilahs, right? Then each of them must have the independent will. If they don't have independent will, then there's only one will. And the other one, the one that is subject to the other one, cannot be the ilah. So he says, let's assume that there's two wills. Either they want the same thing or they want a different thing. If they want the same thing, let's say both of these things want the creation of this plant. Right? Then that shows that one of them must be incapable. Why? Because if the one exacts their will, fulfills their wills and brings about the plant. Okay, there's a fake plant. But anyways, whatever, right? And brings about the plant. Right? Brings about this thing. Then can the other one bring it about if it's already in existence? You can't give existence to something that already has existence. So by the creation of one, it renders the other one incapable. And one who's incapable cannot be an ilah. His quality, he now doesn't have effective will. Can they simultaneously bring about the same? How can they simultaneously bring about the same? You are saying then that you have two agents, two actors for one effect that you cannot claim the one brought about. And if it's and it was both of their will to bring it about, and both of them cannot claim to have brought it about, then both of them don't have effective will. They couldn't bring about what they willed. So even if they want the same thing, then it indicates to the weakness of one of them because only one of them can bring it about. If they both want the non-existence of something to cause it non-existence, then one gives it non-existence. The other one cannot cause non-existence to something that's already non-existent. It's a tautology. It's a fallacy of reason, right? So that indicates that there can only be one. If they want something different, then either what the one once comes into existence and not the other one, but that shows you that the one who didn't bring the thing into existence doesn't have effective will. Or neither of them come into existence, and that shows you that both of them don't have effective will. But we can see something in existence because we can see the universe around us. Therefore, there must be at least one effective will. So our mind is telling us there must be one effective will, and there can't be more than one effective will. Right? And so the mind is also indicating to us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is one. And everything goes back to this one. So how can something veil him when everything goes back to this one? وَهُوَ الْوَاحِدُ الَّذِي لَيْسَ مَعَهُ شَيْءٍ. Right. Then he says, كيف يتصور أن يحجبه شيء وهو أقرب إليك من كل شيء. How is it possible that something veils him when he is closer to you than everything? And we touched on that. And he says, وكيف يتصور أن يحجبه شيء ولولاه ما كان وجود كل شيء. And this we also explained in the proofs of the others. How is it possible to conceive of something veiling him when without him nothing else would exist? ما كان وجود كل شيء. The existence of everything else would not be. Right? يا عجبا كيف يظهر الوجود في العدم. He says, oh, how amazing it is. How amazing it is. يا عجبا كيف يظهر الوجود. How is it that existence becomes manifest in what was the plane of non-existence? أم كيف يثبت الحادث مع من له وصف القدم. Or how is it that a thing that begins to exist, right, it becomes apparent with that which has the quality of being ever existent? How is it that the contingent thing or something that begins to exist becomes established alongside the one who has the attribute of eternity, the one who has no beginning? What's he telling you? How is it possible that this thing that had non-existence can be set up in your mind alongside the thing that has a real existence? Right? Or in other words, how can you take this thing that has wujud dhilli, that only has wujud, that stems from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and set it up to be a rival with the one who has a real existence, the one who brought it about? You understand? How can you take this thing that in reality doesn't have existence of its own, which is literally everything in the universe, that doesn't have existence of its own, and then set it up as a rival for the one who gave it existence, the one who has no beginning? Because the one who has no beginning is the source of everything that has a beginning. So he's telling you, how is all this possible? Essentially, he's asking you a rhetorical question that's telling you, don't be stupid. Allah is. And just like you cannot reason as to how something can veil you, right? You realize, well, I can't be veiled. But then how is it that I am veiled? Goes back to the previous one. The fact that I am veiled reminds me that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in control. I'm in a state of ghafla. And I need to come out of that. I need to turn back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So he's basically telling you everything in existence is indicating to you that Allah is. And everything in existence is unveiling you from the existence of Allah, is making Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala manifest. So how is it that the very thing that is making him manifest, you are being veiled by it? Doesn't make sense. How is it that I am being veiled from the very thing that is unveiling me? Doesn't make sense. So he's essentially telling you, the state of ghafla, it doesn't make sense. Don't be there. Being in the state of ghafla, unmindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it doesn't make sense. So don't be there. Be in a state of dhikrullah. Right. Then he goes on to speak about the adab of the arif. What is the conduct of the knower of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Now you come to the point, you know that you must know Allah. Right? And it's stupid, it doesn't make sense to be heedless of Allah. So what adab must you have with Allah? How should your conduct be with Allah? Right? So the first thing he says is, ما ترك من الجهل شيئا ما ترك من الجهل شيئا من أراد أن يحدث في الوقت غير ما أظهره الله فيه. And I spoke a little bit about this yesterday. He has not left of ignorance anything. Who's the doer? Who did not leave any morsel of ignorance? He says, that person who desires in any given moment, or that occurs in any moment other than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala caused to occur in that moment. He says, anybody that wants to occur in a moment other than what Allah actually caused to exist in that moment, that person has not left even a morsel of ignorance. He's telling you that person, if I were to phrase this differently, that's maybe more understandable English, is that if you're finding yourself, if Allah caused something to happen, and you are desirous, your heart is stuck to other than that having happened, then the person who desires that, he is a full ignoramus. Right? He hasn't even left, if he hasn't left the smallest bit of ignorance, that means he's full of all arrogance, of all ignorance. He's basically a complete ignoramus. Right? So he's telling you, the person that wants other than what Allah caused to happen is a complete ignoramus. And you can consider that from many angles. Why? Because he's imagining that there is a will that is better than the will of Allah, that is more beneficial to him than what Allah already willed, that is wiser than what Allah already willed. So he's telling you, that person who wishes for other than what Allah caused, he's a full ignoramus. Right? He doesn't even have a bit of intelligence. Right? So the tuhma in that, the lack of adab with Allah in that, is that the person that desires other than what Allah brought about, is that he imagines to himself that there is something that would have been more beneficial for him. He imagines to himself that there is something that would have been wiser. Right? And what wisdom is there greater than the wisdom of Allah? What benefit is there to be had other than what comes to you from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And this meaning is encapsulated in a hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, where Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam tells us that inna lawan min amali shaitan, that saying if only, if this and that, that is from the actions of shaitan. Right? When a person looks back and says, how I wish it was a different way. If only this had happened, if only that had happened, if only I had this, if only I had that, if only I did this, if only I did that, if only somebody else was a different way. Right? If only things weren't how they are. Right? Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that opens up the actions for shaitan. That is the door to letting shaitan in. Right? So he's telling you the first adab with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that you never desire other than what Allah already brought about. Right? And again, just to reiterate what I already mentioned yesterday, what does that mean? When we see a circumstance manifest, right? Whether it be poverty or struggle or whatever situation that is, right? Sometimes it's very difficult for our hearts, like what's happening in the world, what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Palestine, what's happening in Gaza at the moment, what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in Libya. You sometimes, you think to yourself, subhanAllah, it's like too much, man. You can't handle it. The craziness, the disorder that's happening in the world. And the next step might be that you wish it away. I wish it wasn't how it is. Right? The person that has that wish, you see, that wish can be had in different ways. That wish can be that I desire to end that circumstance in the future. Right? I wish that it's not like that, meaning going forward, it's not like that. That's okay, because you don't know what Allah made manifest in that moment. It could be that this very next moment, all the suffering in the world will end. I can wish for that, but that's a wish in the future. But that I think that there is something better than the world being today in the state that it is. That is where there lies a criticism or a suspicion of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought about. And the believer never goes to that. The believer tells himself that this situation that we are in, this is the situation that Allah wanted us in. And if Allah wanted us in the situation, then there is good for us in the situation. Why? Because Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam taught us, عجبا لأمر المؤمن إن أمره كله له خير وليس ذلك لأحد إلا للمؤمن. Oh, how wonderful are the affairs of a believer. All of his affairs are good for him. And that virtue belongs only to the believer. إن أصابته سراء شكر فكان خيرا له. If he finds himself in times of affluence, then he shows gratitude, and on account of the gratitude, it is good for him. Not on account of the affluence, but on account of the gratitude, it's good for him. وَإِنْ أَصَابَتْهُ ضَرَّاءُ. If hardship befalls him, if calamity comes his way, if affliction befalls him, صَبَرَ, he is patient, فَكَانَ خَيْرًا لَهُ. And on account of the patience, it is good for him. Right? So, how can it be that we don't want the affliction? The affliction is Allah giving you the opportunity of sabr. Who doesn't want the opportunity that Allah presents? Right? When Allah gives you affluence, how can it be that you don't want that? When affluence is the opportunity for shukr, who doesn't want the opportunity that Allah gives? Right? So the way of the believer is that he doesn't wish for other thing. He sees the opportunity in where Allah put him. Right? He doesn't concern himself with a warid. He concerns himself with a wird. He doesn't worry about what is it that came to Allah from me. I have no control over that. That comes from Al-Hakim. I concern myself with what goes from me to Allah, because that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made me responsible for. Right? And I never wish for other than what Allah gave me. You know, I was thinking of Baytul Maqdis and its situation. Right? And I was thinking about my interaction with Muslims the world over, wherever I've been. Right? And I think that on account of the suffering that we are subject to, there is more Islam and connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than I knew before. Right? My most recent experience of that was when I was in Syria. In the places that were under constant jihad for the last 14 years, literally being bombed and people driven out. It's so apparent how there's more connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala there than there is in the cities that were unaffected. Now, what would you want? Would you want the absence of calamity with the absence of that connection with Allah? Or would you prefer the calamity with the connection to Allah? Only the believer will realize that the calamity with the connection to Allah is far, far better than affluence without that connection. In fact, the one who's sitting in that calamity, and this I experienced as well. One of the mashayikh that we met, Sheikh Abdul Alim, he was here. We met him. We didn't go out to find him actually. We met him by coincidence or by the design of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here in Cape Town. Why did he come to Cape Town? In fact, he went to Durban first. Why did he go to Durban? He was there for the Ijtima. For da'wah. He said, no, these people do da'wah, I'm going to go there to do da'wah. Now you think to yourself,
Like, why is he concerning himself with da'wah? If they in so much turmoil, so much trouble, because they were in that turmoil, in that calamity, but they have a strong connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They looking at everybody else and thinking, subhanallah, what do you have? We need to call you to Allah. Whereas we're looking at them and thinking, what do you have? Your building is broken. It's ajib. Right? And this is just an example. I'm serious. Like, he came here to do da'wah. When we were there, when we were there, we're meeting people like in refugee camps. Right? And they asking us, how's the da'wah scene in Cape Town? Like, are you calling the non-Muslims to Islam? There, where they don't have food to eat, they worried about the iman of people here. Because they see the benefit of it. They have experienced the value of it. So, yes, in future, it's natural that we want benefit for everybody. So going forward, we would want that the difficulties removed. And in fact, we will contribute and invest in that. But we don't wish that the situation that brought them there, we don't wish that away. Right? And any calamity that leads to closeness to Allah is in fact, it is a benefit. And any affluence that distances you from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in reality a calamity. Right? So your first point of adab with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that you have humility with Allah. Don't think you know better than Allah. Don't think you know better than Allah. Right? And the second point of adab with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that you have optimism and good hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That Allah put me here on the apparent it looks bad, but I know Allah has something good in store. I know Allah has something good in store. What I need to focus on is simply that my wird, what comes from me, what goes from me to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is in accordance with what is pleasing to Allah. That's all I have to worry about. Right? When I see the people in difficulty, and am I contributing to alleviation of that? When I see the people distance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, am I contributing to that? When I see myself distant from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, am I trying to bring about the change so that I come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Oftentimes it's on account of the fact that one recognizes the distance from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah brings them closer to Him than they were even before they recognized that. Right? So this is the meaning of this hikmah. مَا تَرَكَ مِنَ الْجَهْلِ شَيْئًا. He has not left even the slightest bit of ignorance. One who desires that occurs in a moment, that appears in any given moment, other than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made manifest in that moment. Right? So the first adab is contentment. Allah, we are happy with you, wherever we are right now, Ya Allah. And we see it as an opportunity, and we have good hope in what will come from you. Right? And just in relation to the circumstance of the world, the relations that in the divine order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, before every victory, there's a purging, there's a cleansing. Right? Like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about the battle of Uhud, لِيَمِيزَ اللَّهُ الْخَبِيثَ مِنَ الطَّيِّبِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala caused that so that the wretched could be made distinct from the pure. Right? And so when we see all the nonsense, the destruction, the calamity that's happening in the world, it's a purification. It's a purification. And in these times, we will see who are those who will contribute, who are those that will put their own desires aside to contribute to the betterment of the world. Why? Not because they focused on the zahir, because they focused on Allah and they know that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be happy with. That may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us in this path to Him. And the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it always results in benefit for everybody else around you as well. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us in this path and make us be content with what He has given us, and let us see the opportunity in every moment such that what comes to us, whether it seems good or it seems bad, is in reality a pathway to greater goodness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I think we'll end there for now. Wa jazakumullahu khairan. Any questions?
No questions? Okay, we're in there for now. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.